bonjour tout le monde. Merci au Dr. Pelletier et groupe pour cette invitation. And that is the extent of my ability to butcher the French language. So I was an Italian major in college. So I'm very grateful for the translation this morning and very grateful for the opportunity to be here. I want to honor that I'm, as I said, I'm in Seattle, Washington, and coming to you from the sacred lands of the Duwamish and Coast Salish tribes here in the Vancouver and Pacific area. And I hope you can see my slides at this point. And
we see your browser now. Okay, that's okay. Good.
Very, very good. Okay. Lots of buttons, lots of things to manage here. But yes, as the kind introduction was mentioned, I'm here to speak to you about the learning health system this morning and how we can attain it. And this will hopefully be I'll keep this as brief as I can, given my time allotment, and hope we have some time for questions later, because I think there's it was great to see the results of the poll. I think there's a lot we can explore here together this morning. So I was asked to talk, let me first mention I'm serving as a senior advisor to the National Academy of Medicine in the United States. However, the perspectives that and opinions you hear this morning are mine alone, and I do not represent the National Academy of Medicine on the whole with these views and positions. And you can see my other consulting and advisory disclosures on the screen there. So I was asked to talk about three things: to understand the origin and evolution of the learning health system, identify the key challenges that have limited its adoption, and offer a vision for what it will take based on everything that was heard in the foregoing presentation, and thinking about how it could really truly have an impact finally at last on health and social services. But I hope you'll indulge a quick personal story, an anecdote that happened to me recently, and how it's shaping my own thoughts about the learning health system. I recently had a pretty common outpatient procedure that involved anesthesia. And people who I know who've had this procedure, that were familiar with it, suggested, don't be put under. Just don't, because you don't want to wake up groggy and tired. Just ask for what they call conscious sedation. And so when I met with the anesthesiologist to voice my preference, he listened to me, he listened very carefully, and he said, based on the type of anesthesia that we use now in this hospital, we have learned, that's the key, that it's best for patients to be fully asleep and you'll wake up feeling fine. So I yielded to his expertise. And in the back of my mind, though, I was thinking, how he said we've learned, and I wanted to know how they learned. Did they learn from a clinical trial? How did they know that for somebody like me, this was, the right evidence that matched my situation? What were the outcomes, et cetera? And this was not an academic teaching hospital. This was basically a community health system. And so you get the idea, but I think it illustrates to me that at many points, even at a very short patient journey, my one encounter, there's so many opportunities to learn in real time and to be a learning health system. I don't know that, that this person wasn't sitting there looking at a computer, looking at his evidence. So there's a lot to be learned about how to learn in the real world. So that's my little anecdote to kind of keep in the back of your mind there. But I think it's also important to think about how we got here, the origins of the learning health system. And this is not new. It is, I would say, a teenager. It's in its adolescence at 15 years old. The term was coined and popularized by the U.S. National Academy of Medicine, which at that time was known as the Institute of Medicine. And this arose in recognition of the substantial gap between what we know in terms of the evidence base and what we do at the bedside or in the clinic and practice. There are knowledge gaps, and I've been working in this space for, pretty much all of these 15 years. And so it's incumbent on all of us to interrogate what it's going to take to get from concept to concrete. And I know that you're all here because you have a dedication and an interest to seeing this concept become a reality. And so I hope that this is a group that can help us chart a course to bring the learning health system to scale at a global level. And so, the learning health system has definitely gained traction The National Academies has a series of publications addressing the different facets. There are many focused data science papers and focus on the digital health infrastructure. And knowing that the SSA Quebec support unit is wholly dedicated to the learning health system is very encouraging to me. You know, the graphics that you see on the screen here illustrate just a handful of different interpretations and permutations. And the SSA Quebec graphic has partnerships at the center, which nicely encompasses the collaborative actions that are needed between and among researchers, clinicians, and patients to realize true systemic improvement. But for the purposes of today's short talk, I'll spend the next few minutes on the National Academy's definition and the work in this area. So as you can see on the screen, the learning health system is defined as one in which science, informatics, incentives, and culture are aligned for continuous improvement, innovation, and equity, with best practices and discovery embedded in the delivery process, individuals and families actively participating, and new knowledge is generated as an integral byproduct of the delivery experience. And this is, I mean, this is a very expansive and ambitious definition, which is commendable, but perhaps, you know, still out of reach for many health systems, given everything that's packed into this definition, from culture to data infrastructure. And we know that many patients are active participants in their healthcare, but just as many are not. That's not yet a ubiquitous phenomenon. So, you know, there's some questions here. If you want to drop anything in the chat about what strikes you as what might be more or less attainable, and we can loop back to that if we have time. So I won't belabor these too much, but what I'd say here is that, you know, these are the 4 components of the NAM's definition. And what I would say to you is that, you know, our ability to generate evidence is phenomenal. You know, we have a very rich and growing evidence base every day. You know, how many articles are published on cancer or COVID or cardiovascular disease. But the ability to take and to mobilize that evidence at the point of care is where we're lagging behind. The informatics element of this definition, that is also a vast terrain unto itself, and it's also deployed fairly unevenly in the healthcare ecosystem. Incentives, particularly in the United States, are tricky given the absence of a single payer system. So an incentive that applies for a clinician is very different from that for those who pay for care, or those you know, researchers engaged in health services or health systems learning, or a patient. So this misalignment of incentives is still something we have to really wrestle with. And then finally, culture, the culture of medicine, the culture of healthcare, the culture of integrating health and social services, that could be an entire discussion unto itself. But it can be helpful to start to unpack these elements a little bit and think about where concerted work and actions can help advance our progress. And I apologize, this is a pretty dense slide. It derives from a publication more than 10 years ago. But the takeaway, and what I want you to, you know, sort of understand from why I've got all this list of things on here, is that some of the things that we imagine that we feel are important for the learning health system are within our span of control, and some are not. So for example, we can create processes in healthcare that are patient-centered and person-centered. We can hire leaders that are committed to the learning health system, and we can assess cost and outcomes. But culture, knowledge, decision-making, trust, those things that are highlighted there on the left, all have organic facets that cannot be fully structured or tightly managed in the same way that you might manage your digital system, for example. And so, you know, we have to think about how we manage the tension between what we can control and what we cannot. And over time, as the learning health system has matured, an evolution has also taken place, in that we have different ways of identifying adjacent types of work, adjacent bodies of work. So you can see again here a list of ways that we have named various variations on the learning health system. And there's, you know, we like to name things. We like to distinguish applied research from embedded research, or knowledge to action and real world evidence. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with putting a label on something, but I would submit to you that it has created some confusion, if you will, some market confusion, and perhaps even distilled the potency of what we're trying to do. So the identifiers on the left all have something in common, though, which is
c'est en bas à droite.
Find knowledge gaps, fill those gaps, and then feed that knowledge back into practice. And I would note that quality improvement and real world evidence have really had traction. The real world evidence concept is maybe newer in terms of a label for this type of work. Quality improvement, of course, has been around for decades. And I was thinking about what executive leaders latch onto, those who make decisions about healthcare. And I just wonder if learning health system is a label and a name that maybe just doesn't quite have the immediate understandability in a way that quality improvement or real world evidence does. I further want to acknowledge, in terms of the evolution of the learning health system, that the field has grown substantially in 15 years, the concept and the field. We have tremendous forward progress to be, happy about and gratified by. There are entire university departments devoted to the learning health system. Your own program at SSA Quebec is an amazing opportunity of to take this work to scale. There are journals and scholarly activities, meetups and interest groups, a range of North American and global exemplars. And just for fun, if you have an Amazon smart speaker, try giving this a whirl. I did this when I was preparing for this talk. I said, Alexa, what is the learning health system? And I was frankly pretty pleased at what she came back with. So if you have a chance to try that at home, it's interesting to hear what you get back in return. I wanted to provide a couple of examples. This was part of my remit for this talk, is to just share very quickly where it's working well and why, and some thoughts about what's working and why. And so the first example I have is Cincinnati Children's Hospital and Medical Center, and they have a center, the James Anderson Center of Excellence, that has launched a program called Healthier Together. This has been around for many, many years. And they've harnessed the principles of improvement science to help build and support sustainable collaborations, learning health networks. So you can think about learning health systems, and then you can knit learning health systems together to create learning health networks. And their work is really anchored in collaboration between patients and families, research teams that are multidisciplinary, clinicians, and it really is a true collaboration. Their commitment to sharing their work is pretty unparalleled. Sharing for them is embedded in their DNA. They offer training, consultations, videos, and really do a lovely job of exemplifying learning in action. So that's one example that I always point to about where to go to learn how to do this. The second is the Accelerating Care Transformation, or ACT Center at Kaiser Permanente, Washington, which is here in my backyard in Seattle. They've had the ethos of a learning health system in place for many years, and it has matured into this robust program called the ACT Center. It's distinguished, I would say, by the leadership's commitment and financial commitment to learning. There's a very close partnership between the very top leaders in the organization and the research team to identify where are the key problems that we can bring research to bear to problem solve. And they've also really established rapid analytic capabilities, because often the time required to do research can be decision makers need information sooner. But at the ACT Center, they have a very robust rapid analytics capability that helps stem that impatience somewhat. So these are two examples I would point you to continue to learn more. Another interesting phenomenon I've been sort of pondering lately is the movement in patient safety, which is a very easy concept for any stakeholder in healthcare to digest. It's how can you say you are against patient safety? It takes diligence and persistence and consistency to achieve, for sure. but it has some of the same compatibility and synergies and principles that you would find in the learning health system. You need everybody aligned on the incentives. You need to create a culture of patient safety. You need data and informatics to show that your patient safety is actually working in terms of from processes to outcomes. And you need evidence about what are the best and most safe ways to care for patients. So I would offer to you that there's an empirical test to be experiment to be had to look at organizations that are robust in patient safety and maybe use the concept of high reliability organizations and those that are learning health systems. I think there's some unification there about how you go about becoming a high reliability organization and how you go about being a learning health system. So I'd like to shift a little bit then and talk about what has hindered adoption. And there's some theories we can explore, again, hoping for some time to discuss. I think there's a real challenge in terms of, especially given the fragmentation in the US, how does learning get paid for, frankly? How do you reimburse and find a business case to support a learning health system? The value proposition for a learning health system, people want to come into a health system, get their care, go away. Does learning, is it value added for all stakeholders? That I think is something we have not explored fully. Another potential hindrance is the complexity of medicine, and that there is kind of a one size fits one because there are infinite configurations at the point of care. And that is coupled with a constant surge of new knowledge coming into the system. Another challenge, I think, this is ubiquitous. I don't think it's unique to the US, but I think our digital architecture and the usability of health data is still, we still have a long way to go there. Some countries are far better at this than the US, certainly, but I don't think we have really attained, interoperable health data at scale. And then finally, and I know we have patient partners on the call, on the Zoom, and I'd love to hear their thoughts on this. What if you're a patient and you say, I'm in a learning health system, does that change your perspective or your perception? Do you want to go to a health system that's learning, or do you want to go to a health system that is knowing, the knowing health system? So we know that there's a lot of room to improve. And I would just say that in the optimistic sense that we should not get discouraged by the magnitude of these challenges, which are many, and this is only a partial list. Having said that, I would just sort of pile on to myself and say that, I do have concerns given the pandemic and the growing trust gap that has spawned, that the learning health system could be vulnerable. And I say that because, throughout the pandemic, we've seen that for the general public, there's not a lot of comfort with things being uncertain and shifting and evolving and ambiguous. And yet that's how science is. We test hypotheses, we adjust, we create new information, and we build a knowledge base. But learning from every patient has that connotation of kind of a guinea pig or being experimented on. So we need to think very carefully about how we shore up trust and communicate about the pivotal importance of learning without creating more ambiguity and uncertainty. So there's a real role here for communication, for health education and health literacy, which is a big, I guess, maybe a soapbox for me. So I'll try not I'll try to stay off my soapbox, but hopefully we can come back to this. And so by now you're probably thinking, gosh, I thought she was going to talk about realizing the learning health system, and she's talked about all the names of it and the things that are getting in the way and what makes it vulnerable. But is she going to talk at all about realizing the learning health system? And so yes, let's shift over to that. This is the vision according to Sarah Greene. We have published this paper in a couple of years ago, but I really would submit to you and hope that we have a learning health system that listens and attends to health literacy for all. And in this diagram, you can see, again, patients and families and even communities would identify questions that matter to them. That spreads out to both the clinicians and the health systems, and also diverse research teams that create studies that are very relevant. So it is rigorous, it is relevant, it is real, and it is, you know, really the true culture of real-time learning. It's yet another diagram, right? It's another permutation of the learning health system, I grant you, but I think having patients in the center is key to this, core to that vision. And how do we get there? Trying to make this go away, but I guess I can't. So to get there, it is attainable. The road is long and it is winding, but I think that there are things that we can consider together that will help us really make progress toward a true patient-centered learning health system. First is making sure that people are directly engaged in co-design and co-production. But at the same time, there's a tension there, right? Because how realistic is it for people who are patients or patients with all the burden of illness, or families or caregivers, and people who are not yet patients, to be fully engaged? Most people don't like to think about healthcare 24/7 the way that, you know, a clinician might, or a health systems researcher might. So how do we bring people to the table and engage them when healthcare is not, you know, the thing they want to be, you know, spending their time on? How does health literacy really fit into this? Is it a prerequisite to have health literate patients, or does it become a byproduct? How do we measure that we are achieving the learning health system? We don't really have an amazing measurement system to show that the learning health system concept is having a desired impact on care improvement. And I know, especially for this audience, the integration of healthcare and social needs is imperative. And so can we create a real-time learning system that also addresses a person's social needs that are outside of the, you know, the clinical care processes? And then finally, and most importantly, the aspect of health equity and health justice. We have so much work to do to reduce inequity and provide just healthcare. And so applying an equity lens as we undertake learning activities is absolutely non-negotiable, particularly for Indigenous communities and other communities of color. Learning has to be with and for these communities, not done to them. So I think that needs to really be at the core of everything we discuss, and would love your ideas in this vein. So just a few more comments about how we might undertake concerted efforts to realize the learning health system. And this has both organizational elements as well as individual elements. So at the organizational level, if you're working in a system, whether it's a healthcare system or a research center, do you have time? Do you have dedicated time and space allocated to exploration, discovery, and sharing? Do you have an environment and access to resources that enable you to learn and have an opportunity to collaborate or reflect? Because you can't just, you know, learning has to happen with some space around it. And then I think at the organizational level too, what I've seen is that learning has to be appreciated in its own right. And I visited a health system many years ago that was at the beginning of a journey that wanted to become a learning health system. And they said, how do you even start? How do you create they said, a culture of curiosity? And I thought that was really interesting because, you know, we sometimes take for granted that curiosity and the will to learn is there. But sometimes it really does have to be catalyzed from the inside out. Relatedly, there are individual level attributes that also support learning. And again, it goes back to what I was just saying about curiosity, humility, tolerance for ambiguity, to that previous notion about dealing with uncertainty. And it also takes vulnerability at the individual level. I would say that vulnerability and humility are two keys to this. And it's not in our nature to be to be humble and be vulnerable, up front and first and foremost, because it could be regarded as a sign of weakness rather than a sign of strength. And so a key insight from my work at what is now Kaiser, and at the time was called Group Health Cooperative, is, learning what works in health system improvement can be very messy. There are apt to be missteps and stumbles. And so creating a climate where failure is not only tolerated, but encouraged is critical. And yet, right, in high stakes, high performing environments that are filled with smart clinicians and smart researchers, it might be difficult or even discouraged to say, I don't know, or we need to learn more. So we get back to establishing that right culture of curiosity and willingness to learn. And I would submit to you that, when it's properly framed, the ability to learn from failure can actually lead to resilience, adaptability, and organizational strength. So finally, and I'll wrap this up here in just a couple minutes, for those looking to attain, if you're at the beginning of the journey to attain a learning health system in a province or a health, in a local environment, a clinic, embracing the fact that there are different dimensions is important, because learning takes on many different facets. You have to be able to accommodate learning at the operational level, the technical level, having a human resources, sort of a human-centered capability that facilitates learning, a policy and governance environment that supports learning, and of course, a financial and a business case. And all of these are quite interdependent, and you cannot really take them in isolation. I know I put forward a lot of concepts and ideas this morning, and health system change is just a monumental undertaking. Could be quite daunting and quite overwhelming, but I'm actually pretty optimistic for several reasons. And I would say, first of all, the literature is providing us with many more blueprints and lessons on how to move the learning health system from concept to action, from aspirational to real. The technology communities and the business leaders, especially here in the US, but elsewhere, they are also standing up learning communities. There's an entire company based here in Seattle that has brought together, I think 20 or 30, they're up to 30 health systems now, and they're devoted to using data to create learning communities. And then finally, even though it's hard to recognize very many positive things from the pandemic, it has been instrumental in accelerating evidence development and dismantling some of the really calcified barriers to collaboration and learning. And I've seen the application of evidence in practice at light speed as a consequence of COVID-19. And I guess that's, it's not the brightest silver lining, but it is an important one. And I think that it will help accelerate the learning trajectory. I will leave you with this powerful quote from Kedar Mate at the Institute for Healthcare Improvement in Boston. This really comes down to relationships between human beings. So much of improvement work is about relationships and doing that hard work to support and change mindsets, values, and cultures. So please take this encouragement about relationships and these other signals of process. I think we can get there together. So merci beaucoup. So much more to discuss. I wish we had more time, but I will stop there. And I have some French here that I won't butcher again, but merci. And I'll stop sharing and we can go back to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Madam Greene. You were right on time, and I've heard your countdown timer beep, so that's a good practice. Bravo. We have time for a couple of questions. I'll switch back to French, but I will ask you the questions in English, so you don't have to go into the interpretation. Donc, merci, Madame Greene. Petit mot, on a eu des questions pour savoir si les présentations seraient partagées. Je vous donne l'adresse web et vous recevrez des courriels de suivi, adresse web de l'unité SSA Québec. Donc, les présentations et les enregistrements vidéo seront diffusés là, dans les prochains jours ou semaines, là, le temps de traiter tout cela sur le site de l'unité SSA Québec. On a une première question que je pose à Mme Greene, qui est au sujet des assurances et des différences entre les États-Unis et le Canada, parce qu'évidemment, on a un système différent au Canada par rapport aux États-Unis. Alors, on a eu une question pour demander à Madame Greene pour savoir qu'est-ce qu'elle voit, elle, comme différence et comme enjeu. So, Madame Greene, the question is about the differences between the systems in the US and in Canada in terms of insurances. So we would like to hear you about what do you see as differences in the systems and major insights on this.
Sure. Thanks for the question. I think because Canada is a single payer system and the US is the exact opposite, deeply fragmented, I think I would submit to you that in a single payer system, the ability to create incentives to support learning might be a little easier. There's one less, major barrier that could get in the way. I think in the United States, because there is no way to submit, if you will, kind of a medical code to reimburse learning, people can just create whatever incentives they want at a health system level, but it impedes us from getting to learning at a much broader scale. I would think that's a major difference. I will offer that I'm not as familiar as I should be probably with how the Canadian payer system works, but I think that simply by having a more singular universal approach to financing healthcare, you definitely have a leg up on the United States and all of its fragmentation.
Thank you, Madame Greene. Je vois qu'on a eu des mains levées, mais à la quantité de personnes qu'on a, on ne prendra pas d'intervention spontanée à main levée, mais j'ai reçu plusieurs questions, j'en reçois par le Mentimeter en envoi direct aussi. There's another question, Madame Greene. I'll ask it in French and then in English. Donc, on avait la question à savoir... attendez, il faut que je la retrouve, il y en a plusieurs qui viennent d'arriver. Au sujet de l'unité SSA Québec, on voulait savoir pour Mme Greene quelles devraient être les prochaines étapes et on devrait faire attention à quoi. So, Ms. Greene, about the SSA unit in Quebec, you've seen the presentation at the beginning of the workshop. So we would like to ask you, considering where our unit stands, what would be our next step forward and what should we be careful about?
Oh, wow. What a fantastic question. I think you were so fortunate because your program is so advanced, and you have, from everything I've read about your program, you have thought about many of these concepts and issues in depth. The two things I would ask about or suggest as possible next steps are, what is the data and information environment? Is it equally mature in all provinces and at all health systems? And to what extent are you confident that the health data generated in each system or across Canada is robust and sufficient for supporting learning? That's one. And second, I think, I have so many things I want to say, but I'll just pick on two. What should governance look like for a learning health system at a clinic level or a province level? Does it need to, and how does local context within a province play in? Because I know, British Columbia is not the same as Quebec, is not the same as, so is there a governance structure or governance best practices that could be brought to bear to support learning and a broader learning health system? So those are two among many that I would offer. I've got a whole longer list for another day.
Thank you. Je reçois beaucoup de questions. Je tiens à vous dire, on n'aura pas le temps de toutes les prendre, mais il y a un souci de la part de l'unité SSA Québec de pouvoir traduire, pas traduire, mais répondre, trouver des réponses à toutes les questions qui seront posées. Donc, elles sont archivées et on verra dans les suivis de l'événement pour essayer de vous les envoyer. Je vois, Mme Greene, vous faites oui, donc vous m'entendez dans l'interprétation. Oui? Parfait. Donc, je n'aurai pas à répéter en anglais mes prochaines questions. On a le temps pour une petite question. En passant, on a eu plusieurs commentaires pour vous remercier de votre présentation qui était, selon certains, claire comme le cristal, crystal clear, et qui vous remerciez pour avoir parlé de culture de curiosité. Quand on a fait nos sondages en début de rencontre, il y avait une proportion majoritaire de gens du domaine de la recherche. On a une question en lien avec la recherche où on demande quel rôle voyez-vous pour les programmes universitaires de formation des professionnels de santé afin de contribuer au développement de cette culture d'organisation apprenante. Donc, quel rôle pour les programmes de formation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, something I think we can test empirically. So the fusion of many of the systems that have risen in the US to embrace the learning health system have research units embedded, or they have very close partnerships with an academic, a university that is close by. And so I think having the embedded, if you will, the embedded capability to conduct research within the system is really what had jump-started the learning health system in the United States. So you take a system like the Veterans Administration Health System here, where they have researchers working in clinical practice, and that, you know, sort of can start the ball on that culture of curiosity and that culture of learning, because researchers are by their nature, you know, curious and inquisitive and always asking, well, what about this? And how can we measure, you know, this? How do we know that metformin is better than this other new diabetic medication, for example? And that is what I think creates that mindset and that culture of curiosity. And it's not that systems without teaching or university affiliations cannot do that, but I think it's just a difference that has to be acknowledged and recognized. That if you're working in an academic medical center like Harvard or Duke, where the researchers might also be practicing clinicians and vice versa, that is I guess one formula for catalyzing that culture of curiosity. And so those without that have to, you know, to my example at the very beginning of my talk, the place I went for my procedure is not, I don't think they've probably ever heard the term learning health system, to be quite honest, so.